Joyriding. Short story by Jim Knofton. Peter glanced at the clock on the bookshelf. It was 4:15. 15 minutes to freedom, he said to himself. 15 minutes until he could turn off the metronome. 2, 3, 4, and stop moving his fingers across the keys. For Peter, the best part of the day began at the moment he stopped practicing the piano. Beginning at 4:30 each day, he had an entire hour to himself. He could read science fiction. He could play video games in the den. He just couldn't leave the house. This had never really bothered him until the afternoon 3 weeks earlier, when he'd seen the runner gliding up Putnam Street hill. Something about the way the older boy looked, something about the way he moved, drew Peter away from his music and out onto the porch to watch the runner race by in his maroon and gold Darden High School sweatshirt. That night at dinner, his mother had said, "Mrs. Kennedy says she saw you on the porch this afternoon. I hope you weren't neglecting your music." "I was just saying hello to a friend," Peter lied. He didn't even know the other boy's name. Intimidated by his mother's intelligence network, Peter had not ventured back onto the porch for 3 weeks, content to watch from his bench as the older boy churned up the hill and off to the oval behind Peter's junior high school. But the previous afternoon, as he'd watched the second hand on the parlor clock ticking away the final seconds of his captivity, 2, 3, 4, Peter had decided to go back out on the porch. He thought he might wave as the runner strode by, but instead he studied the older boy in silence. The runner was tall, lean, and broad-shouldered. "I am none of that stuff," Peter thought. The runner had sharp features. Peter's nose looked like he had flattened it against a window and it stayed that way. The runner had a clear, steady gaze. Peter was nearsighted and tended to squint. The runner had a shock of copper-colored hair. Peter had a frizz so fine it was hard to say what color it was. In spite of these differences, Peter could have imagined himself in the other boy's place were it not for the runner's grace. The way the boy moved reminded him of music. His legs had the spring of a sprightly melody. His arms pumped a relentless rhythm. He ascended the hill almost effortlessly, as though gravity were no greater hindrance on this steep incline than it had been on the prairie flat main street below. He must never lose, Peter thought. That was another way in which they were different. Peter had just come in third in the piano competition sponsored by the university, after coming in second in the contest sponsored by the orchestra and third in the contest sponsored by the bank. "Peter," his mother said, "you are a perpetual runner-up." Then she decided that rather than practice for 1 hour every day, he should practice for 2. 2 hours! But 2 hours were now up, and as Peter stopped the metronome, he spotted a familiar figure in a maroon sweatsuit at the bottom of the hill. "Who is this kid?" Kevin asked himself. Kevin McGrail had not yet reached the crest of Putnam Street when he noticed the pudgy boy in the orange t-shirt on the porch of the white stucco house. At least he's on the porch today, Kevin thought. For 3 weeks, the kid had watched him from his piano bench. Every day, as he pounded up the hill, Kevin could hear this weird, tinkly music coming from the stucco house across the street. Then there would be a pause as he passed by, and he would see the little frizzy-headed kid looking at him through the window. Then the weird, tinkly music would begin again. At first, Kevin felt kind of spooked when the music stopped, like maybe Freddy Krueger was going to jump out of the bushes or something. But after a while, he just wondered why the kid was so interested in him. It wasn't like he was a big star or anything. Kevin was number 3 on the Darden cross-country team, a nice steady runner who could be counted on to come in ahead of number 3 on the opposing team. Coach Haggerty always told him he could be number 2 if he worked at it, but Kevin thought working at something was the surest way to turn it from a pleasure into a chore. Just look at what happened with Mark Fairbanks. He and Kevin used to hang out together, but that was before Haggerty had convinced Mark that if he devoted his entire life to cross country, he could be a star. Well, Marky was a star, all right. He was the fastest guy on the team and one of the top runners in the district. But he was also the biggest drone in the school. Every day at the beginning of practice, he would shout, "Okay, it's time to go to work." Kevin felt the strain on his legs lighten as he reached the top of the hill. He saw the road flatten before him and felt the crisp autumn air tingling pleasantly in his lungs. As soon as this becomes work, he said to himself, I quit. Mom, Peter said at dinner, I want to go out for the football team. His mother looked up from her Caesar salad with an expression of exaggerated horror. Think of your hands, she said. Peter had known she would say that. Well, maybe basketball then, he replied. That is every bit as dangerous. Peter had kind of figured she would say that too. Well, I want to do something, he said. Something where there's people, where there's guys. His mother put down her fork, pressed her palms together in front of her face, hooked her thumbs under her chin, and regarded him from over her fingertips. Now we are getting serious, Peter thought. What about choir, his mother proposed. I haven't wanted you exposed to a lot of influences, musically, I mean. But I'm not insensitive to your need for companionship. Peter shook his head. How about cross country, he asked. It's only running. How about that? Sports are nothing but trouble, his mother said. Trouble and disappointment. I think you will agree it's much more satisfying to devote yourself to something at which you can really excel. There's a boy on the high school team who runs up at the oval every day, Peter said. He told me I could practice with him. His mother pursed her lips. If Peter could only have explained his plan to her, he was certain she would have said yes. But he wasn't ready to try that. He could barely make sense of it himself. One thing he was quite sure of, that boy who ran past the house every day was a champion. He would know what separates winners from perpetual runner-ups. And if Peter could learn that, well, then his mother would be happy. And if his mother was happy, well then, everything would be okay again. All she had to do was say yes. You still owe me 2 hours at the piano every day, she said. Kevin was surprised to see the little piano player up at the oval the next day. The kid was dressed in one of those shapeless sweatsuits they wore in junior high school gym class. Looks like he's already winded, Kevin thought as he watched the kid struggle through about a dozen jumping jacks. I hope he doesn't hurt himself. Kevin was beginning his second lap when the kid fell in beside him. Hi, the boy said. Hey, said Kevin without slowing down. I'm getting in shape for next season, said the boy, who was already breathing heavily and losing ground. It's good to give yourself a lot of time, Kevin said, not meaning to sound quite so smart-alecky. See you around, the boy called as Kevin opened up the space between them. Every day for the next 3 weeks, the routine was the same. The kid was always waiting when Kevin arrived. He would puff along beside Kevin for a few strides, try to start a gasping conversation, and then fall hopelessly behind. The kid was obviously never going to be a runner, Kevin thought, and he sure didn't look like he was enjoying himself. Yet there he was, grinding away just like Fairbanks, only without the talent. You're a better person than I am, Kevin thought, or a sicker one. That Friday, when Kevin got to the oval, the chubby kid took one look at him and started to run. It was as though he were giving himself a head start in some kind of private race. The thought of some competition between the two of them made Kevin laugh, because he generally lapped the kid at least 5 or 6 times each session. He put the little piano player out of his mind and tried to focus on the rhythm of his own footfalls. The following weekend, he and the rest of the Darden team would be competing in the district championships. And Kevin had begun to think it might be a good time to answer a question that had been nagging at him for the last month. He wanted to know how good he was, not how good he could be if he devoted his entire life to cross country, but how good he was at the moment. What would happen, he wondered, if he ran one race as hard as he could? Part of him did not want to know. Suppose he beat out Billy Kovacs, number 2 on the Darden team. That would mean Coach Haggerty would be all over him. He'd expect Kevin to have a big season in his senior year, maybe even to make it to the state championships. Just thinking about the way Haggerty put his gaunt face up next to yours and shouted, "Go for the goal!" was enough to stop Kevin in his tracks. On the other hand, he might not beat Billy Kovacs, and that would be depressing too. Kevin liked to think of himself as somebody who could run faster if he wanted to run faster. But if he went all out and still finished in the middle of the pack, it would mean he was just another mediocre high school runner. Maybe I should run a nice, easy race and forget about this, Kevin thought. It would be less complicated. As he began the 7th of his 8 laps, Kevin noticed that the chubby kid was still running, puffing and panting and lurching from one foot to another. "This is my bell lap," he gasped as Kevin trotted by. Kevin chuckled at the idea of the little piano player in a race. But when he finished his workout, he stopped to watch the other boy circle the track one last time. This was the kid's 4th lap. Kevin had never seen him run more than a kilometer before, and he felt a sneaky sense of pride at his training partner's accomplishment. The kid came chugging down the track, gulping huge bites of air and clutching his right side. But when he reached his imaginary finish line, he threw both hands in the air and held that pose for a moment before collapsing onto the grass. Kevin was about to jog over when he heard a voice in the stands announce, "And the winner in the Pudge Ball Olympics, Peter Whitney." Kevin turned quickly and recognized 3 kids from the freshman class at school. "Hey, why don't you bozos take off?" he said sharply, and looked at them long enough for the kids to understand that he meant it. The piano player was still lying flat on his back when Kevin reached him and extended a hand to help him to his feet. "Thanks," the boy said in a barely audible voice. Hours after he had arrived home, Peter kept replaying the details in his head to see if there was something he had missed. First, the fudge brains from grade 9 had made fun of him, and the runner had taken his side. Next, the older boy had waited around while Peter caught his breath. Then they'd walked down the hill together all the way to Peter's house. It was almost like they were friends. But things had begun to go wrong as soon as Peter tried to ask him his secret. The trouble was he couldn't figure out how to put the question in his own words. And so he began talking like the books his mother read to help her get ahead in her office. "Do you visualize your goals?" he blurted. The boy looked at him quizzically. "Some people do that," Peter continued, eager to fill the silence. "But other people, they say that you should concentrate on developing the habits of highly effective people." The runner didn't respond, so Peter felt compelled to keep talking. "Do you think your habits are effective? I mean, are they consistent with your aspirations, you know?" The other boy shrugged. "You still play the piano?" he asked. 2 hours a day, Peter said. "You like it?" "No," Peter said. "I mean, yeah, I used to." "But now you don't?" Peter did not want to waste time talking about himself, but the older boy seemed genuinely interested. "Before we came here, I had a different teacher," he said, and as he did every time he sat down at the piano, he began to think of Mickey Ray. Mickey was his teacher back in Rochester. He taught part-time at the university, and at night he played in clubs. Peter's mother didn't like him because he wore a ponytail, but everybody told her that he was the best teacher in town. She let Peter take lessons from him on one condition, that they play only performance pieces, compositions Peter might later play in a competition. But Mickey did not always abide by this condition. Every once in a while, he would pull out a new piece of music from his satchel, wink conspiratorially at Peter, and ask him to give it a try. This was how Peter got to know jazz and ragtime and gospel music. After Peter played through the piece once, Mickey would sit down on the bench beside him. "Next time," he would say, "a little more like this." And off he would go, playing the same notes in the same order, but making the piece sound more fluid, more powerful, more alive. It's not about hitting the right key at the right time, Mickey used to say. It is about taking this baby for a ride. Peter began to tell the other boy about Mickey Ray. He sounds cool, the runner said. My teacher now is better, Peter said. Actually, he wasn't sure if that was true. Mr. Brettone is a superior musical pedagogue, his mother had said. But lately, Peter had found himself imagining that Mr. Brettone had a tiny pickaxes attached to his fingertips, and that each time he struck a key, it would crack and crumble. They were standing in front of the house by the time Peter finished the story, and he was no closer to learning the other boy's secret than he had been before all those grueling afternoons on the oval. Finally, just as the other boy was about to leave, he blurted, "How do you do it?" Do what? Win. I don't know anything about winning, the runner said. I just know about running. Then came what Peter found the most puzzling exchange of all. I hope you win at the districts, he said as the boy jogged away. Now what would I want to do that for? The runner called back. Kevin stood among the throng of 200 runners packed into the clearing just off the first fairway of the Glen Oaks Golf Club. At the crack of the starter's pistol, they would all surge forward onto the manicured expanse of the fairway. The sight of all those bodies churning in all those bright uniforms bobbing up and down was so captivating that during his first 2 seasons, Kevin had hung back at the beginning just to take in the spectacle. Not this year, though. He had decided to run the race of his life, and moments after the gun was fired, he found himself in the first fourth of the great mob of runners struggling for position as they tore toward the first green, where the course cut sharply downhill and into the woods. As he hit what he thought of as a good cruising speed for the first stage of the race, Kevin couldn't help wondering if he would wear himself out too quickly or collapse on the grass at the finish line like that crazy little piano player. It was strange to be thinking of him at a time like this, or maybe it wasn't. Because what Kevin had been trying to figure out all along was whether excelling at his sport would somehow ruin it for him, the way excelling at the piano had ruined it for Peter. He half suspected that it would be something the kid had told him that day Kevin had walked him home that had given him the half-hearted kind of hope. In the pack just ahead of him, Kevin picked out Mark Fairbanks, Kovacs, and a couple of the top runners from the other schools he had raced against during the year. No question, he was a lot closer to them than he usually was at the kilometer mark. As the runners streaked by, Peter cheered and pointed his friend out to his mother. It had taken heroic persuasion to get Mom to come out to a cross-country meet on a Saturday morning, but now he was sure that everything would go just the way he planned. His friend would win the race, and then Peter would introduce him to Mom. He wasn't really certain what would happen after that. He couldn't really explain why he wanted them to meet. It wasn't so that Mom could see that he was making friends at school, because she thought friends only distracted him from the piano. And it wasn't because he thought she would be impressed by the cross-country champion, since Mom didn't really appreciate sports. Peter wanted them to meet so that Mom could see that he had a little of the runner in him, a little bit of the champion, a little bit of something that would lift him beyond the status of a perpetual runner-up. If he could only convince her of that, maybe it wouldn't be so hard to keep sitting down alone at the piano, or to keep sitting down to dinner with her. He's not winning, Peter's mother said as they watched the runners cut off the fairway and into the woods. It's strategy, Mom, Peter told her, though he too was wondering why his friend was not at the head of the pack. They were tearing along the old railway bed at the top of the ridge near the fourth tee. Kevin's legs still felt strong. His breath came easily. Fairbanks, who was fighting for the lead, was just a speck up along the train tracks, but Billy Kovacs was only 18 meters or so ahead of Kevin. I can take him, Kevin thought, but then I'll have to hold him off the rest of the way. He hesitated for a second and then decided to pick up his pace. A single runner in the maroon Darden uniform came streaking out of the woods and onto the 10th fairway. There was less than a kilometer remaining in the race. That isn't your friend, Peter's mother said. Another runner in red and white charged out of the woods a few meters behind. In a few moments there were 6, 7, and then 8 other runners pounding down the last kilometer towards the finish line. Peter didn't recognize any of them. "I'm sorry, dear," his mother said, rummaging in her purse for her car keys. Peter felt as though he had bet a lifetime of allowances on the wrong horse. As he tore out of the woods and onto the 10th fairway, Kevin began counting the people ahead of him, a feat made more difficult by the sweat dripping into his eyes. There were 15 of them, as nearly as he could tell. The top 10 finishers went on to the state finals. Somewhere up along the railroad tracks, the desire to be in that group had seized him, and he had picked up his pace. Now the wind burned in his lungs, and the acid burned in his calves. His Achilles tendons felt like guitar strings being tightened with each footfall. He had less than a kilometer to make up 6 places. He glanced quickly across the fairway and saw Fairbanks dueling for the lead with Pat Connors of Tech. In the crowd behind them, he saw the little piano player. He was gazing in Kevin's direction, disappointment etched on his face. "I'm running the race of my life and it isn't good enough for him," Kevin thought. He could feel the anger rising inside of him. The race was ruined for him now, and he began to doubt his motives. Was he really running all out just to see what it felt like, or had the attention of this peculiar little kid made him hungry for more? Kevin wanted a sense of purity back. He wanted to stop caring whether he finished in the top 10. Something inside of him whispered, "Slow down." But instead, he emptied his mind and kept running. Into that emptiness floated the memory of the conversation he and the little piano player had had just a few days before. This kid had been talking about his old teacher, the one who liked to take the piano for a ride. "I can't play," Kevin thought, "but I can run. This can be my ride." Imagining that he was Mickey Ray, Kevin focused his eyes on the ground in front of him and sprinted the last couple of 100 meters, unaware of the screaming fans or the other runners on the course. Peter couldn't understand what the big fuss was about. The kid had come in 11th. That wasn't even good enough to qualify for the state finals. Yet people were acting like it was a bigger deal than Mark Fairbanks, who had come in 2nd. It was pretty cool to take a minute off your best time, he supposed. But still, 11th place wasn't worth all the cheering the Darden fans did when the kid crossed the finish line. Besides that, Kevin McGrail looked horrible. When he had glided up Putnam Street 6 weeks ago, he had been so smooth, so poised. Now he was bent over, walking like he had a sunburn on the bottom of his feet. Peter saw the boy's coach, a gaunt man wearing a baseball cap, put an arm around Kevin's shoulder. "You dug down deep and came up big," the coach barked. Kevin drew a few rapid breaths. "I was joyriding," he said. "Joyriding," Peter repeated to himself as he sat at his piano later that afternoon. "Joyriding lands you in 11th place." He stood up and opened the piano bench and withdrew the exercises Mr. Brett Tone had assigned for that week. Beneath it he found the Fats Waller songbook. Mickey had given it to him as a going-away present. Peter thumbed through the pages until he found "Your Feet's Too Big." Just the title made him laugh, and the way Mickey used to play it. He looked up to see his mother standing in the doorway. "What are we featuring this afternoon?" she asked. "Exercises for the left hand," Peter said, as he sat down to work.